The Hunt for Matthew Hines, a nearly two-decade journey. Historical background and location. Nestled within the rolling hills of rural Wisconsin, Black Hawk Lake has long been celebrated as a quintessential slice of Americana, a place where time slows down and nature reigns supreme. For decades, it served as a serene retreat for families, fishermen, and outdoor enthusiasts yearning to escape the hustle and bustle of urban life. The lake, named after the famous Sauk leader Black Hawk, carries with it whispers of history from a bygone era when Native American tribes roamed its forests and used its waters for survival. Even now, its tranquil beauty evokes a sense of harmony with the natural world. Surrounded by dense woodlands and sprawling farmland, Black Hawk Lake is a sight to behold. When morning dawns, a soft mist drapes itself over the mirrored surface of the water, and the echoes of birdsong ripple across the shoreline. Families often gather by the lake's sandy edges, grilling burgers, launching small fishing boats, and eagerly anticipating the chance to hook largemouth bass. During the summer months, the lake becomes a hub of community activity, with locals barbecuing on portable grills, kids chasing fireflies under the fading glow of the sunset, and couples taking quiet sunset strolls along its wooded trails. The image is idyllic, almost too perfect to be touched by anything but peace. But this postcard-perfect image changed forever in the fall of 2003. The lake, once a symbol of tranquility, became the scene of one of Wisconsin's most puzzling and bone-chilling crimes. On a crisp October morning, one that began as any other, the quaint, sleepy town was jolted to life when a gruesome discovery shattered its calm. A fisherman, looking for his early morning catch, stumbled upon a bloated, heavy plastic bag tangled in the reeds along the shoreline. The sight itself was odd but not immediately alarming until the reality of its contents began to seep into the town's collective consciousness. It was within this backdrop of serene Americana that chaos found its way. Families who once felt comforted by Black Hawk's still waters now viewed it as tainted by a dark and inescapable shadow. Local cafes became makeshift gossip hubs where people whispered theories about what could have happened, while nightly news headlines brought images of the lake into homes far beyond Wisconsin. How could such an unthinkable tragedy strike at such a beloved and peaceful place? The shocking events that followed would stretch well beyond the confines of Black Hawk's peaceful shoreline, pulling the entire region into an investigation that would take nearly 2 decades to reach its conclusion. For the community, however, Black Hawk Lake remains an enduring paradox. Even as the crime receded into memory, pushed aside by smaller local dramas and the humdrum motion of rural life, scars lingered. What does it mean for a place of sanctuary to become forever tied to an act so violent, so completely at odds with its character? For Wisconsin and for America at large, Black Hawk Lake became emblematic of that unsettling truth. Darkness can hide in the most unexpected places. The shocking discovery. It was a cool, crisp autumn day in October of 2003 when the serenity of Black Hawk Lake's shores was irrevocably shattered. The morning began like any other. Birds chirping in the trees, sunlight filtering gently through the thick blanket of Wisconsin's famed hardwood forests. Sophie Carter, a lifelong resident of the idyllic town nearby, decided to take her usual morning stroll with Max, her aging golden retriever. It was her ritual, finding peace and quiet along the lake's edge before the day's responsibilities took hold. Little did she know that particular walk would mark the end of Black Hawk Lake's age-old reputation as a haven of comfort and calm. Max, typically laid back and happy to follow Sophie's lead, behaved differently that day. He began pulling on his leash furiously, barking at something near the water's edge. Annoyed yet curious, Sophie approached the spot where Max had fixated his attention. The first thing she noticed was a faint, foul odor wafting through the crisp lake breeze. At first she thought it might be a decayed animal, not uncommon in the wild surroundings of Wisconsin. But as she stepped closer, her gaze landed on something far more alarming. An enormous, bloated black plastic bag tangled in the thick reeds near the shoreline. The sight struck her as odd, but it wasn't immediately terrifying, at least not yet. Sophie assumed it might be trash carelessly dumped into the lake, a crime all its own in a town so proud of its natural beauty. Still, there was something about the bag's proportions, the weight it seemed to convey, and the way it strained against the pull of the reeds that unsettled her. Hesitant but unable to turn away, Sophie nudged the floating mass with a stick she'd picked up. The bag shifted slightly, revealing even more of its unnatural bulk, and that's when the overwhelming stench hit her full force. Something was profoundly wrong. Sophie froze, her breath catching in her throat. She backed away quickly, her heart pounding as her imagination spiraled wildly. She fumbled for her phone and dialed 911, her voice trembling as she described the mysterious object to the dispatcher. Within minutes, police officers and emergency personnel began arriving at the scene. Yellow crime scene tape soon cordoned off the picture-perfect shore, and curious neighbors began swarming the area, trying to get a glimpse of the chaos that had engulfed their quiet town. The discovery of the bag's contents would turn Black Hawk Lake into ground zero for one of the most chilling and puzzling criminal investigations in Wisconsin's history. Inside, authorities uncovered the body of a middle-aged man, wrapped meticulously in multiple layers of plastic, weighed down by heavy rocks. The victim's body showed clear signs of trauma, and the methodical way it had been concealed hinted at something far more sinister than an everyday crime of passion. The scene turned from unsettling to horrifying as the forensic team worked late into the day, extracting evidence from the site. Rumors flew through the town like wildfire. Who was the victim? Was this a random act of violence or something premeditated? The town, which had prided itself on its closeness and security, began to feel alien, as though danger had been lurking just beneath the surface all this time. For Sophie, life was never the same after that grim October morning. Despite being lauded as the accidental hero who set the entire investigation in motion, she couldn't shake the image of that bag floating eerily in the water, or the suffocating guilt that came with being the one who had uncovered such a horrifying truth. Meanwhile, as news of the discovery spread, Black Hawk Lake became the unlikely focal point of national intrigue, leaving this once peaceful corner of Wisconsin forever etched into the annals of true crime history. The first clues. When the initial shock of discovering the body settled, investigators wasted no time in combing through the details of the scene at Black Hawk Lake. Every branch, every blade of grass, every ripple in the water became a potential piece of the puzzle. For a crime of this magnitude, the smallest shred of evidence could be the key to unlocking the mystery. In this case, the most promising starting point was the victim himself and what he carried with him into the cold, dark waters of the lake. As the forensic team worked meticulously to examine the body, they discovered a few important items on the victim. Among them was a lighter, innocuous at first glance but bearing a faintly engraved series of numbers, 0593. To anyone else, it may have looked like nothing more than a personalization, but to seasoned detectives it immediately sparked curiosity. Was it a phone number, a locker combination, some kind of coded message connected to the victim's life? The lighter ignited far more questions than answers. Another key piece of evidence was a crumpled receipt found tucked into the pocket of the man's jacket. Though partially waterlogged and faded, technicians in the crime lab were able to salvage enough of it to make out a few critical details. The receipt was dated about 2 weeks prior, and was issued from a convenience store in a small town about 50 miles away. This discovery broadened the crime's scope significantly. What was this man, now dead, doing at a quiet lake in Wisconsin, when he'd seemingly been in a completely different area not so long ago? What was the connection, if any, between these locations? The police now had a crucial lead that allowed them to identify the victim, which is often the first and sometimes hardest step in solving a murder. By cross-referencing the phone number from the lighter and details retrieved from the receipt, they traced the items back to a man named Richard Blake. Richard was a 47-year-old businessman from Chicago who had been reported missing by his family just 10 days earlier. His sudden disappearance had puzzled family and co-workers alike, as Richard was known to be a punctual and well-organized man who rarely deviated from his structured routine. In fact, his absence had only deepened their concern because he'd been involved in what was described as a major business deal at the time he went off the radar. For detectives, identifying Richard Blake was a critical breakthrough but also came with a whole new set of questions. Why had Richard, a Chicago resident with no known ties to the area, turned up dead in Wisconsin? What business had brought him there and who might have wanted him dead? His crisp business attire suggested he'd been in the area for a professional purpose, but nothing about his belongings indicated he'd planned for an extended stay. There were no bags, no money, no personal items other than what he was carrying in his pockets. It was almost as if someone had wanted to erase his very presence. Further investigation into Richard's life began to paint the portrait of a man who was both respected and envied. He was a self-made entrepreneur who had overseen a variety of real estate projects throughout the Midwest. By all accounts, he was ambitious, intelligent, and ruthless when the situation called for it. But with great success often comes great resentment, and Richard's career was not without its share of burned bridges. As detectives delved deeper, they learned that his most recent deal, one rumored to involve a large piece of commercial property, had been fraught with conflict. There had been disputes, unpaid debts, and at least one heated legal battle with a business associate. All of this fed into a growing theory. Richard's death wasn't just a random act of violence, but a calculated move, possibly tied to his professional endeavors. The simplest clues, a lighter and a receipt, became the jumping-off point for what seemed to be a complex web of betrayal and greed. As investigators began reaching out to those who knew Richard personally or professionally, a list of potential suspects began to form. Some colleagues described him as a man of integrity, while others intimated he could be cutthroat when money was at stake. In particular, one name came up repeatedly, a man named Matthew Hines. A former partner-turned-rival, Hines had a history of legal disputes with Richard, and their bad blood was well documented. Even more suspiciously, Hines had recently gone off the grid, with no one able to account for his whereabouts. Despite the promising leads, the case was still an uphill battle for the investigators. Even as they dug through financial records, phone logs, and the digital traces of Richard's life, they were up against a clock. Accusations and conspiracy theories swirled as media coverage picked up momentum. The image of Black Hawk Lake, still, serene but now shrouded in darkness, dominated headlines, and the victim's story captivated the nation. Each passing day without a resolution threatened to further unravel the tenuous sense of security the community had once taken for granted, yet for all the mystery surrounding the case, the investigators remained steadfast. The lighter and the receipt, while modest clues, were more than enough to set the wheels of justice in motion. They knew the path would be long and winding, but with every step, they were inching closer to answering the question that hung over the entire town: who killed Richard Blake, and why? Signs of a conspiracy. As the pieces of the puzzle began to take shape, investigators couldn't ignore the unsettling signs that Richard Blake's murder was not merely an impulsive act of violence. Instead, it bore the hallmarks of something far more deliberate, calculated, and sinister. A conspiracy meticulously constructed, one link at a time. Black Hawk Lake, once a serene backdrop for summer picnics and family fishing trips, was now ground zero for unraveling one of Wisconsin's most enigmatic criminal plots. The tipping point came when detectives started digging into Richard Blake's professional history. While attempting to piece together the final days of his life, they uncovered a network of unresolved disputes, questionable dealings, and fractured business relationships that seemed to follow Richard wherever he went. He had built his fortune as a no-nonsense real estate developer in Chicago, a world known for its cutthroat negotiations and big-stakes risks. His success had earned him unwavering respect from some, yet it elicited just as much envy and hostility from others. At the heart of the intrigue was Richard's latest project, a multi-million-dollar property deal targeting prime commercial real estate in the Chicago suburbs. This wasn't just any deal, it was a high-stakes endeavor that had the potential to make or break those involved. Throughout this deal's negotiation, tensions had been simmering among its key players. Legal disputes had cropped up, rumors of betrayal circulated with increasing frequency, and one of Richard's business rivals, Matthew Hines, emerged as a particularly vocal opponent. Hines, once a trusted collaborator, had become one of Richard's fiercest adversaries over the years. Their partnership had soured over an earlier disagreement involving unpaid debts. Lawsuits were filed, bitter accusations were hurled, and by the time of Richard's death, Hines's anger had turned into something corrosive. It became clear to investigators that Hines had ample motive to harm Richard. But was it vengeance alone, or was there more at play? Detectives began piecing together breadcrumbs that pointed toward an intricate scheme. Forensic accountants combed through Richard's financial records, uncovering peculiar transactions in the months leading up to his murder. Black Hawk Lake, a seemingly random and tranquil spot, now looked more like a deliberate choice for disposing of a body. Scattered clues like text messages from burner phones and cryptic notes in Richard's planner hinted at clandestine meetings and shadowy interactions. Even more chillingly, interviews with those closest to Richard revealed that shortly before his disappearance, he had confided in a colleague about feeling watched. He mentioned strange cars lingering outside his Chicago office at night and anonymous phone calls with no one on the other end. This wasn't paranoia. There was intent behind every unnerving moment. What raised eyebrows further was the lighter engraved with, 0593 found in Richard's pocket. A minor detail on its own, but its appearance during the investigation became significant when it was remotely tied back to Matthew Hines. It wasn't just a keepsake, it was dated back to an era in which Hines and Blake had worked together, a physical reminder of a partnership turned sour. Furthermore, the receipt found in Richard's pocket from the convenience store, nearly 50 miles away from Black Hawk Lake, raised the question, what had brought him to that particular store? Surveillance footage from the location showed nothing definitive, but Richard had visibly been looking over his shoulder, as though anticipating someone, or something. As investigators widened their scope, they began exploring the possibility that Hines hadn't acted alone. Pulling off a crime of this scale, especially one involving meticulous body disposal and coordination across state lines, seemed like too much for one person. The meticulously wrapped body, the transportation of a lifeless Richard from Chicago to Wisconsin, and the familiarity with Black Hawk Lake's secluded areas, all spoke to a group effort, a conspiracy engineered with chilling precision. Forensic evidence supported this theory. Impressions of tire tracks near where the body was discovered showed the marks of a heavy-duty pickup truck, equipment Hines was known to own. Hair fibers found on the plastic wrapping hinted at more than one individual involved, although testing these materials for profiles would take time. Meanwhile, inquiries into Hines's known associates revealed a small but loyal network of acquaintances whose financial trails suggested they benefited, directly or indirectly, from Richard's demise. Some had received large sums of cash just weeks after he disappeared, while others appeared to suddenly settle debts that had been hanging over their heads for years. A growing theory was starting to emerge. Matthew Hines may have orchestrated the murder of Richard Blake to simultaneously resolve old grudges and profit handsomely from his death. Investigators believed Hines saw Richard as both an enemy and a lucrative opportunity. Killing Richard not only eliminated problematic competition but also gave Hines unfettered control of a valuable property deal he otherwise would have lost, and possibly financial gains from Richard's assets. But the question remained, who else had a hand in carrying out this heinous plot? As days turned into weeks, the town of Black Hawk Lake began to buzz with rumors of a conspiracy. Everyone had their theories. Was Hines the mastermind or just a scapegoat for something larger? Could Richard have uncovered something he wasn't supposed to, leading to his demise? The locals, once bound by small-town camaraderie, found themselves looking sideways at neighbors, wondering who might know more than they let on. To the detectives, the focus on Hines and his possible network became paramount. They monitored financial transactions, cross-checked phone records, and examined every detail of Richard's recent interactions. The deeper they dug, the murkier the waters became. The signs of a conspiracy were impossible to ignore, and what they were uncovering was confirmation that Richard Blake's death was anything but ordinary. It was calculated, it was cruel, and it was only the beginning. A large-scale investigation team in action. The gruesome discovery at Black Hawk Lake quickly escalated from a local investigation to one of the biggest criminal cases in Wisconsin's history, triggering the mobilization of multiple law enforcement agencies. What began as a small-town issue, one that local police initially believed might involve a simple missing person or accidental death, soon spiraled into a multi-layered investigation. With little to go on but a body wrapped in plastic and a few cryptic clues, the authorities knew they needed reinforcements. That's when the big players got involved, the Wisconsin State Police and the FBI. When word of the case reached the Wisconsin State Police headquarters, veteran investigators recognized its complexity. The presence of a meticulously wrapped body dumped in an isolated location suggested premeditation and careful planning, traits not usually associated with crimes of opportunity. Furthermore, early forensics hinted at a potential interstate aspect, pushing the jurisdiction beyond local authorities. The FBI advised deploying their behavioral analysis unit to analyze potential suspects and their motives, and to determine what sort of mind could carry out such a meticulous act. With federal agencies joining the effort, a makeshift task force was assembled within 48 hours. It included seasoned detectives from Wisconsin, forensic experts from federal labs, digital trace analysts, and a team of financial fraud specialists. Each brought a unique skill set to the table, and each approach was essential to understanding the layers of deception that surrounded Richard Blake's death. The collaboration would mark a turning point in the investigation, transforming it into one of the most exhaustive criminal probes the region had ever seen. The task force set up its headquarters in a repurposed town building not far from Black Hawk Lake itself. The building became an outpost of organized chaos, with whiteboards covered in scribbled timelines and diagrams, maps of Wisconsin and Illinois with dozens of pins marking locations of interest, and bulletin boards plastered with Richard Blake's business connections, known associates, and criminal records of anyone even remotely tied to him. Agents worked around the clock on leads brought in by both the field teams and forensic experts. Phone calls were made, warrants were issued, no stone was left unturned. The level of effort was staggering. Divers combed the lake bed for any additional evidence, meticulously sifting through the silt for objects that might have been discarded along with the body. Aerial drones combed the surrounding forests, while cadaver dogs were brought in to sniff out any additional dumping grounds or concealed evidence. Helicopters buzzed overhead, scanning the landscape for possible vehicle routes that might have been used to transport the body to its watery grave. The task force was determined to reconstruct not only Richard's final hours, but also the precise movements of whoever had been responsible for putting him there. Despite these expansive efforts, solving the murder wasn't just a matter of scouring crime scenes. Much of the real work came from following cold, hard data. Forensic accountants began untangling the convoluted web of Richard Blake's financial dealings. His bank records outlined a life filled with high-stakes real estate transactions and large sums of money shifting mysteriously between shell companies. Detectives reviewed property disputes, lawsuits, and business partnerships, convinced that somewhere in these financial mazes lay the motive for his death. The sheer volume of documents was overwhelming, hundreds of pages of contracts, invoices, phone records, and corporate emails that investigators painstakingly sifted through for any shred of incriminating evidence. Meanwhile, FBI technicians worked tirelessly to resurrect damaged files from Richard's laptop, which had been found split in half and submerged in the lake alongside his body. On a parallel front, digital analysts pored over Richard's cell phone records and email archives to reconstruct his communications in the days leading up to his disappearance. At the same time, investigators traced the origin of the infamous convenience store receipt found in Richard's pocket. Surveillance footage from the store was analyzed frame by frame, trying to identify faces, vehicles, or anything else suspicious that might connect Richard to the scene. Additionally, a unit specializing in behavioral profiling began assembling a psychological profile of the potential killer, or killers. Based on the precision and the effort taken to hide the body, they theorized that this was someone who was extremely meticulous, calculating, and perhaps even methodical in their personal and professional matters. This wasn't some unplanned act of rage, but a cold, deliberate strategy. The profiler's assessment narrowed down possible suspects, pointing investigators toward individuals with a history of fraud, high-stakes financial disputes, or prior violent tendencies. The task force also left no room for human error when it came to connecting dots. Dozens of interviews were conducted, stretching from Richard's most trusted business associates in Chicago to neighbors and shopkeepers in the small Wisconsin towns where the investigation led. Witnesses described seeing unfamiliar vehicles or strangers in town just days before the body was discovered. Former employees of Richard's companies told stories of bitter quarrels over money and power that had left lasting grudges, and over again, two names surfaced amid the turmoil: Richard Blake and his increasingly controversial rival, Matthew Hines. Yet Hines was nowhere to be found. When investigators began looking into his whereabouts, they were met with vague, conflicting stories. Some believed he had gone on an international property-buying trip. Others hinted that he had sold most of his assets and vanished altogether. The first major breakthrough came when the task force cross-referenced financial withdrawals from an offshore account tied to Hines. Despite shutting down his primary businesses, Hines had recently made several high-value purchases, most alarmingly, a newly registered heavy-duty truck that matched tire impressions found near Black Hawk Lake. The case against Hines was growing stronger by the hour. At the center of it all was an unrelenting focus on following every possible lead, no matter how inconsequential it seemed. Each piece of evidence added a layer to the complex narrative unfolding around Blake's murder. What had begun as local police responding to a distressed jogger's 911 call had transformed into a multi-state manhunt for a suspect who may have gone to extreme lengths to cover his tracks. Despite the mounting workload, there was no shortage of determination within the task force. Every investigator knew that solving this case meant more than just finding a killer. It was about restoring peace and delivering justice to a family that had been ripped apart by a callous act of violence. As the investigation widened, tensions, both within the task force and throughout the small Wisconsin community, grew palpable. This wasn't just about solving a murder, it was about peeling back the layers of deceit, ambition, revenge, and greed that had turned Black Hawk Lake into the staging ground for a crime that shook the nation. With every new breakthrough, the task force inched closer to unraveling the mystery. But they also knew that their work was far from over. Somewhere out there, the person, or people, responsible for Richard Blake's death were watching the investigation unfold, carefully calculating their next steps in a game of cat and mouse that had only just begun. The prime suspect and the manhunt. From the outset, all signs pointed toward Matthew Hines as the prime suspect. His connection to Richard Blake, both as a former business partner and as a rival with a bitter history, placed him squarely at the center of the investigation. Matthew Hines was no stranger to controversy. He carried a long list of financial grievances, including accusations of fraud, misappropriation of funds, and even violent outbursts in corporate settings. To those who knew him, Hines was a man with a sharp business acumen but an even sharper temper, and perhaps most tellingly, his presence in Richard's life had always been contentious, a mix of collaboration and conflict that seemed to teeter perpetually on chaos. For investigators, Hines was not just a person of interest, he was the embodiment of opportunity, motive, and means in a case that had shocked the nation. But there was one glaring problem. Matthew Hines was nowhere to be found. By the time investigators began closing in on him, tracking his movements and scrutinizing his connections, Hines had seemingly vanished off the face of the earth. His offices in Chicago were eerily quiet, his bank accounts were suspiciously inactive, and his closest confidants were either evasive or completely out of touch. It was as if Hines had anticipated this all along and preemptively erased his presence from the world. The manhunt for Matthew Hines soon became one of the most expansive efforts undertaken by law enforcement in recent years. The FBI, already heavily involved in the case due to its interstate nature, issued a federal arrest warrant, prompting task forces across multiple states to coordinate their search. Tips began flooding in from various sources, some credible, others clearly fabrications. Hines had reportedly been spotted boarding a charter plane in Chicago, crossing into Canada on foot, and even laying low on a family farm in Iowa. Every lead had to be followed, but each one seemed to end up being a dead end. In their pursuit of Hines, authorities uncovered a string of carefully laid diversions designed to mislead investigators. Bank records revealed that Hines had quietly withdrawn large sums of money from offshore accounts, spread across shell companies, just days before Richard Blake's body was discovered. Surveillance footage from a parking garage in downtown Chicago captured Hines loading suitcases into the back of a black SUV, footage dated the day after Blake was believed to have been killed. It was apparent Hines wasn't just fleeing, he was executing a meticulously planned escape. As the search intensified, investigators pieced together a theory about Hines's methods. Early in his career, Hines had dabbled in real estate fraud, using forged identities to manipulate property records and evade scrutiny. It now appeared he was employing similar tactics to stay one step ahead of his pursuers. By tracking a trail of forged documents and rental agreements, detectives suspected Hines was using multiple aliases to travel across the country. Each false identity opened up a new chapter in his life as a fugitive, allowing him to rent apartments and vehicles while leaving minimal traces behind. The task force also discovered evidence of Hines's ties to individuals involved in criminal networks, including forgers and traffickers who specialized in fabricating new identities. This network undoubtedly helped Hines remain undetected for so long. By piecing together phone and email records, investigators identified a forger in Miami who had supplied Hines with a falsified passport under the name Derek Willis. Unfortunately, by the time agents raided the forger's apartment, both the suspect and Hines were long gone. For nearly 2 years, Hines's trail went cold. His disappearance became an almost mythical storyline in true crime circles, with media outlets dubbing him the Vanishing Tycoon. Speculation grew wildly. Had he slipped into another country with no extradition agreement? Was he hiding out in a lavish mansion purchased under a dead relative's name? Or had he died quietly, taking his secrets with him? Speculation was all the public had because, for law enforcement, Hines remained an elusive ghost. Then, fate intervened when an unexpected breakthrough came via a routine traffic stop in Arizona. A patrol officer, unaware of the high-profile case, pulled over a vehicle for a broken taillight and noted that the driver's identity seemed suspicious. The driver, claiming to be Samuel Drake, appeared nervous, avoiding eye contact when questioned. A fingerprint scan at the precinct revealed what authorities had failed to uncover for years. Samuel Drake was none other than Matthew Hines. The arrest sparked an immediate media frenzy. Heinz's appearance after years on the run was disheveled and far removed from the sharp-suited businessman once featured in glossy magazine profiles. He had been living under the radar, taking on temporary construction jobs and moving frequently between small desert towns. When interrogated, Heinz remained silent, offering no explanation for his disguise or his years of evasion. But his capture marked a monumental turning point in the investigation, giving law enforcement the chance to finally hold him accountable. The arrest also triggered new avenues of inquiry. Where had Heinz been over the years, and how had he avoided capture for so long? Had he acted alone, or were others complicit in aiding his escape? Investigators began the painstaking process of uncovering the intricate network that had enabled Heinz to remain undetected. They followed the money trail once again, examining transactions dating back to the time of his flight. Old acquaintances were re-interviewed, and new leads emerged, painting a picture of a man driven by greed, desperation, and the fear of facing justice. One discovery stood out among the rest: documents seized from a storage locker rented under one of Heinz's aliases. Inside were detailed plans for the property deal that had sparked his conflict with Richard Blake, along with handwritten notes outlining a timeline that eerily aligned with Blake's final days. Most damningly, there was a diagram of Black Hawk Lake itself, marked with specific locations and notes on accessibility, a chilling confirmation that Heinz had scouted the area in advance. Despite his capture, Heinz's involvement in Blake's murder still required unearthing the full truth. Prosecutors worked to piece together an airtight case using every shred of evidence gathered during the years-long investigation. Heinz, for his part, continued to deny any involvement at first, maintaining his innocence even as the walls of evidence closed in around him. But investigators knew it was only a matter of time before they uncovered every strand of the web Heinz had woven around himself. The journey to bring Matthew Heinz to justice was far from over, yet his arrest marked a turning point not only for the investigation, but for the family of Richard Blake, who had spent years living under the shadow of unanswered questions. The manhunt that had consumed law enforcement agencies, baffled the public, and captivated the media appeared to have reached its climax. But justice was still waiting in the wings. Life on the run. Matthew Heinz's life on the run was a carefully constructed balancing act between survival and evasion, a dual existence where every decision, no matter how small, was a calculated move to stay one step ahead of the law. For nearly 2 decades, Heinz managed to remain a ghost, slipping through the fingers of law enforcement as though he had mastered the art of vanishing. His escape from the spotlight was not only extraordinary, but also deeply unsettling, illustrating just how far someone could go to rewrite their life in pursuit of freedom. After fleeing Chicago in the immediate aftermath of Richard Blake's murder, Matthew Heinz all but erased his old identity. Friends, associates, and even family members reported that he simply disappeared without a trace. Investigators later discovered that Heinz had spent weeks carefully planning his escape well before Richard's body even surfaced at Black Hawk Lake. His financial records revealed deliberate withdrawals from offshore accounts, money funneled quietly into obscure channels, providing him with the resources he would need to live off the grid. With a background in real estate and fraud, Heinz knew exactly how to manipulate paper trails. Under a series of carefully crafted aliases, he adopted a pattern of constant movement, never staying in one place for longer than a few months. Each identity was supported by falsified documents, driver's licenses, social security numbers, and rental agreements. Heinz became Derek Willis in Florida, a low-profile landscaper taking on odd jobs in the Miami suburbs. As Sam Grayson in Wyoming, he posed as an employee of a small ranch, blending in with the locals in rural isolation. By the time he became John Miles in Texas, he looked nothing like the photos law enforcement had been broadcasting on national news for years. His appearance, once polished and professional, also changed dramatically. Gone were the tailored suits and clean-shaven face that accompanied his former life as a high-powered businessman. Instead, he grew a grizzled beard, wore cheap clothes from thrift stores, and took to wearing baseball caps pulled low over his brow. To anyone he encountered, Heinz appeared as nothing more than a drifter, a quiet, forgettable presence who left no lasting impression. But Heinz's life on the run wasn't just about hiding, it was also about staying alive. Despite the relative freedom afforded by fake identities, he lived a life of immense austerity. His days were consumed by grueling manual labor to support himself, taking on cash-only jobs that wouldn't leave a digital paper trail. Heinz dug ditches, fixed fences, and worked long shifts in construction. There was an irony in a man who had once negotiated multi-million-dollar property deals now spending his days hauling gravel or repairing roofing tiles in the sweltering Texas sun. Hines was not only physically elusive but also psychologically detached. To maintain his anonymity, he severed all ties to his former life. He avoided phone calls, social media, or anything that could place him within the reach of investigators. Even those closest to him, business partners, friends, and even family, were left with unanswered questions about his whereabouts. To stay ahead, he lived with a level of paranoia that dictated every aspect of his existence. Hines avoided large cities, stuck to small remote communities, and steered clear of anything that might lead to unnecessary interactions with law enforcement. Despite his remarkable ability to fade into the background, Hines faced close calls more than once. In Montana, he narrowly avoided a police checkpoint by ditching his car on an isolated country road and continuing on foot for miles before finding refuge in a small-town motel. In Louisiana, a suspicious landlord grew wary of Hines's vague backstory and attempted to report him to local authorities. Each time, Hines's resourcefulness and ability to stay calm under pressure allowed him to slip away before anyone could piece together who he really was. But every close call came at a cost, forcing Hines to start over yet again, abandoning whatever modest comforts he'd managed to scrape together. What made Hines's fugitive lifestyle even more chilling was his ability to function in plain sight. He often presented himself as the picture of normalcy to those he encountered, an unassuming man who kept to himself, worked hard, and asked for nothing. In some communities, he even developed a reputation as a trustworthy, albeit quiet individual. No one would have suspected that they were renting a room to one of the FBI's most wanted men, a suspected murderer hiding in broad daylight. It wasn't just his aliases that protected him, it was the systems he relied on. Hines mastered the art of exploiting gaps in oversight, particularly in towns and states where background checks were lax or non-existent. He used burner phones, prepaid in cash, and paid rent directly to landlords rather than through bank accounts. He worked jobs that didn't require tax documents, staying clear of digital systems that could flag his identity. His use of forged passports allowed him to travel when needed, avoiding airports but crossing state borders freely by car or bus. Emotionally, the life Hines had built for himself was a lonely one. He became a prisoner of his own choices, always looking over his shoulder, always wondering if he would be recognized. Investigators later suspected that Hines's long, solitary periods on the run were rooted in more than just necessity. They were also a way of coping with the enormity of his guilt and the weight of his actions. Each passing year only deepened his isolation, transforming him from a man driven by ambition to a recluse shackled by fear. Yet, no matter how far Hines ran, there were things even he couldn't control. Technology had advanced dramatically in the years since his crime. Governments had implemented facial recognition databases, biometric trackers, and other tools that eventually made his fabricated identities harder to maintain. What Hines didn't anticipate was that the world he was hiding from was growing smaller by the day. His once foolproof methods, paper trails, burner phones, and fake IDs, were becoming increasingly obsolete. For nearly 20 years, Hines lived like a ghost, moving through the cracks of society like vapor, invisible to the world around him. But he could never shake the inevitable truth. No matter how far or how fast he ran, justice was always catching up. And it was only a matter of time before the world would remember him, no longer as an unremarkable drifter or laborer, but as the man who turned Black Hawk Lake from a peaceful retreat into the epicenter of one of the most extraordinary manhunts in American history. Technological advancements in solving the case. The investigation of Richard Blake's murder wasn't just a test of human determination, it was a battleground for emerging technologies and the evolving face of modern law enforcement. What had started as a grisly discovery in a remote Wisconsin lake eventually became a landmark case in how advancements in technology could break through where traditional detective work reached its limits. Over the course of nearly 2 decades, technology became the silent hero of the investigation, pushing boundaries and connecting dots that once seemed beyond reach. From the moment the investigation began, the recovery and analysis of evidence benefited immensely from forensic science, an area that saw rapid advancements in the 21st century. One of the earliest breakthroughs stemmed from the way investigators handled the body of Richard Blake and its mysterious wrapping. The plastic material used to encase the body was unlike anything typically found in household use. Instead, it was identified as industrial-grade material common in certain shipping and construction industries. High-resolution microscopic analysis was able to pinpoint unique chemical markers in the plastic's composition, linking it back to a specific manufacturer in Illinois. This connection allowed investigators to identify potential suppliers, narrowing down businesses that had purchased the material, a trail that would later lead to suspects with ties to Matthew Hines. Even more critical was the role of DNA analysis, which had leapt forward in both speed and precision over the years. Early in the investigation, hair fibers tangled in the plastic wrapping offered only limited insight. However, with advancements in DNA extraction techniques, investigators revisited the evidence years later and managed to build a partial genetic profile of an unidentified individual. Combined with progress in familial DNA profiling, detectives were able to link the mystery person to known associates of Hines, further confirming the theory that he had not acted alone in carrying out Richard's murder. Another major leap came in the form of digital forensics. Richard Blake's laptop, discovered split in half and waterlogged at the bottom of Black Hawk Lake, initially seemed like a lost cause. However, as data recovery technology improved, forensic technicians managed to extract fragments of emails, calendar notifications, and even search history from the battered device. These fragments painted a picture of a man deeply entangled in high-stakes business disputes in the days leading up to his death. More importantly, the laptop revealed Blake's attempts to schedule a last-minute meeting on the morning of his disappearance, a meeting with an unnamed contact whose identity investigators believed to be Hines. Telecommunication technology also played a pivotal role. Cell phone triangulation, though in its infancy at the time of Blake's death, became increasingly accurate in the years that followed. By pulling historical cell tower data, investigators retraced Richard's last known movements and uncovered routes and locations that coincided with the convenience store receipt found in his pocket. Surveillance footage from the store had previously proved unhelpful, but video enhancement software allowed technicians to clean up grainy footage years later, revealing a black SUV parked in the background, an SUV later linked to Hines. The surveillance footage breakthrough wouldn't have been possible without the advent of artificial intelligence, AI, in analyzing visual data. AI software was used to cross-reference the enhanced footage with a national registry of license plate records, ultimately leading investigators to the vehicle used in Blake's suspected abduction. The software's capacity to analyze thousands of license plate images per minute provided a speed and accuracy that human investigators could never achieve. Once the vehicle was identified, its registration tied directly back to one of Hines's shell companies, a critical piece of evidence in the growing case against him. Financial tracking technology was another cornerstone of the investigation, as authorities worked to untangle the web of offshore accounts and fraudulent transactions tied to Hines. Forensic accountants relied on cutting-edge software capable of identifying patterns across disparate financial records. These tools parsed through years of Hines's business dealings, flagging unusual transfers and links to clandestine networks of forgers and criminals. Investigators found that Hines had been funneling money into anonymous accounts for years, building a financial safety net that allowed him to vanish after Blake's murder. However, this pattern eventually betrayed him, with an AI algorithm identifying a specific offshore account that had been reactivated just months before Hines's capture. The reactivated account led directly to a payment made to purchase a fake passport under his alias, the final breadcrumb that sealed his downfall. Facial recognition technology also emerged as a game-changer late in the investigation. When Hines was on the run, law enforcement agencies employed state-of-the-art facial recognition programs to scan crowds at airports, train stations, and border crossings. Although Hines evaded detection for years, the expansion of global facial recognition databases eventually worked against him. A random traffic stop in Arizona may have been the moment of his downfall, but it was the patrol officer's access to a facial recognition database that uncovered Hines's true identity within hours. Without this tool, his alias would have continued to shield him from justice. However, technology wasn't just about solving the crime, it played a monumental role in uncovering the deeper conspiracy behind Blake's murder. Social media monitoring tools and advanced data mining techniques uncovered connections between Hines and several individuals who had received large sums of money following Blake's disappearance. These tools sifted through years of online communications, piecing together coded messages and hidden agreements between conspirators. One such lead revealed that Hines had been working with criminal forgers to create multiple identities long before the murder took place. text patterns and metadata analysis from burner phones linked to Hines helped expose a network of accomplices who had aided in carrying out the murder and covering his tracks. Perhaps the most notable technological advancement was the broader integration of machine learning in investigative work. By feeding the accumulated data into machine learning algorithms, investigators were able to identify patterns and correlations overlooked by even the most experienced detectives. The program built a timeline of Richard Blake's final days, cross-referencing phone pings, financial transactions, witness statements, and physical evidence to produce a cohesive narrative of events. This synthesis of information allowed law enforcement to anticipate Hines's movements, culminating in his eventual capture. The case of Richard Blake's murder highlighted not only the tenacity of law enforcement, but also the indispensable role of technology in achieving justice. What once might have been written off as an unsolvable cold case became a shining example of how technological advancements could unlock answers buried for decades. From DNA and AI to financial tracking and digital forensics, the tools used in this investigation transformed the very fabric of police work, providing a blueprint for solving even the most complex crimes in the future. As the investigation closed, and Matthew Hines was finally convicted, one truth became apparent. No matter how intricate the web of lies or how far the suspect runs, technology continues to tilt the scales in favor of justice. For the Blake family, the use of these advancements was more than just tools. It was hope, focus, and a relentless pursuit of the truth. The raid and confession of the crime. On a humid morning in early June 2023, a quiet residential street in a suburb of Phoenix, Arizona, transformed into the epicenter of a high-stakes operation. Federal agents and local officers had assembled in force, their vehicles parked discreetly along the road and around a small, nondescript house, a house that, beyond its peeling paint and overgrown lawn, was believed to hold one of the FBI's most elusive fugitives, Matthew Hines. After nearly 2 decades, their prime suspect in the murder of Richard Blake was finally within reach. The operation was the result of months of painstaking work, combining data analysis, tip tracking, and sheer persistence. Investigators had been analyzing one of Hines's last known aliases, Samuel Drake, and traced his movements to the small desert suburb. Reports of a man matching Hines's description, living under the radar and paying rent in cash, had tipped off authorities. But this wasn't just another false lead. Exhaustive surveillance confirmed that the man inside the house rarely left and had no car registered in his name. He maintained an unassuming presence in the neighborhood, seemingly just another temporary resident passing through. A SWAT team executed the raid at dawn. The street was eerily still apart from the rhythmic hum of cicadas and the quiet rustling of agents making their final preparations. The plan was swift and surgical. Approach, secure, and neutralize any resistance with as little escalation as possible. At approximately 6:15 a.m., a heavily armed team emerged from unmarked vehicles, taking strategic positions around the home while a lead agent calmly announced through a bullhorn, "Matthew Hines, this is the FBI, come out with your hands up." Despite the intensity of the moment, there was no immediate response. The team waited, scanning the house for movement. Then, suddenly, a shadow passed across one of the curtained windows. Hines, disheveled and visibly gaunt after years on the run, emerged cautiously, his hands raised slightly, as though weighing the price of his resistance. Even after nearly 20 years, he carried himself with a faint air of defiance, but it was clear this was the end of the road. The agents swiftly apprehended him, securing his hands behind his back and ushering him to an awaiting squad car. There was no struggle, no last-ditch attempt to flee, only the resigned silence of a fugitive who had run out of places to hide. The arrest reignited media fervor around the Black Hawk Lake murder. Forensic analysts and journalists alike speculated about the details of Hines's life on the run, but law enforcement had little time for public chatter. Instead, Hines was immediately transported to a high-security federal facility where detectives, attorneys, and interrogators prepared to confront him with 2 decades of accumulated evidence. For investigators, this was the moment they had chased for years. The opportunity to extract the truth from the man they had long suspected of orchestrating one of Wisconsin's most infamous murders. Hines initially maintained a stubborn wall of silence during the first round of questioning. Seated in a stark, windowless interrogation room, he stared down his team of interrogators with an air of dismissal, as if daring them to prove their case. But prosecutors were patient, armed with years of evidence, expertly timed questions, and testimony that only seemed to tighten the net around Hines with every passing moment. Detectives detailed the forensic discoveries, the logistical ties to Richard Blake's murder, and the financial breadcrumbs that highlighted his attempts to profit from the crime. They were meticulous but relentless, peeling away every layer of Heinz's supposed innocence. The turning point came after investigators presented a crucial piece of evidence: handwritten notes and a map recovered from a storage unit Heinz had rented under an alias. The notes outlined an eerie timeline of the events leading up to Richard Blake's death. They described clandestine meetings, points of dispute, and even scrawled remarks about Black Hawk Lake. No longer able to explain away the mountain of evidence, Heinz's composure cracked. For the first time since his arrest, he looked visibly shaken, his facade of denial giving way to something darker. A confrontation with the knowledge that his lies could unravel no further. Over the next several hours, Heinz began to speak. At first, he offered piecemeal confessions, circular and self-justifying explanations that attempted to shift blame to external circumstances. But as the weight of his own words set in, and as he was confronted repeatedly with irrefutable facts, something shifted. It was a small but unmistakable fracture in his demeanor, a crack in the wall he had diligently maintained for nearly 2 decades. "Fine," he muttered after one particularly pointed question. "You want the truth? You already know it." What followed was a chilling, methodical confession. Heinz admitted to luring Richard Blake to an isolated area under the pretense of resolving a heated financial dispute connected to their multi-million-dollar property deal. He described how tensions had escalated, leading to a confrontation that spiraled out of control. In his anger, Heinz confessed to striking Blake, a single act of violence that set in motion a cascading series of decisions. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," Heinz mumbled, almost more to himself than to the detectives. But his words offered little comfort or redemption. Following Blake's death, Heinz meticulously wrapped the body in industrial plastic, a material sourced directly from one of his construction projects, and transported it across state lines to Black Hawk Lake. He chose the lake for its seclusion, confident that no evidence would ever resurface. He even described weighting the body down with rocks, a cold and chilling detail that left investigators stunned. "I thought it'd stay at the bottom," he admitted flatly, as though he were recounting the logistics of another business transaction rather than the disposal of a human life. As shocking as the confession was, Heinz also revealed another layer to the crime. He had not acted entirely alone. While he remained the mastermind, Heinz admitted that he had hired accomplices at different stages of the cover-up, relying on their expertise and discretion to ensure his escape. These revelations sent investigators scrambling to follow up on the individuals Heinz implicated, widening the scope of the case even further. The confession left no room for ambiguity. Heinz detailed each step with chilling precision, weaving a narrative of greed, impulsivity, and cold calculation. He revealed not only the crime itself, but the fear and paranoia that had driven him into hiding for nearly 2 decades. But for all his confessions, Heinz stopped short of expressing true remorse. To the very end, his words reflected a man more preoccupied with being caught than the moral weight of his actions. The aftermath of Heinz's confession served as a reminder of just how far justice had come. The raid, his arrest, and his eventual confession marked the culmination of nearly 20 years of meticulous investigative work. What began as a seemingly unsolvable mystery buried in the reeds along Black Hawk Lake had transformed into an undeniable triumph of persistence, teamwork, and modern technology. For the family of Richard Blake, the confession was a bittersweet moment, a long-awaited answer to a tragedy that had left their lives forever changed. The fateful conclusion. The courtroom was uncharacteristically silent as the judge read out the final sentence. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For Matthew Heinz, the man who had spent nearly 2 decades as a ghost to law enforcement, the game was finally over. The decision was swift, clear, and definitive, the culmination of years of tireless work by investigators, lawyers, and forensic teams. But more importantly, it was the end of a shadowy chapter that had loomed over the Black Hawk Lake community and the family of Richard Blake for far too long. Heinz's trial became one of the most talked-about legal battles in the country, drawing spectators, media coverage, and legal analysts who debated every detail of the case. The prosecution presented an airtight narrative, built on years of evidence unearthed by law enforcement using modern technology, dogged perseverance, and old-fashioned detective work. Every move Heinz had made since that fateful day Richard Blake's body was discovered, every financial transfer, every alias, and every calculated decision, had been carefully catalogued and laid bare before the court. The prosecution painted a damning picture of a man consumed by greed and willing to go to unspeakable lengths to protect his ambition, even if it meant taking another man's life. The courtroom itself became a stage where the drama of justice played out. Family members of Richard Blake sat in stoic resolve, their presence a testament to the years they had spent yearning for this day. Hines, on the other hand, cut a different figure from the confident, ruthless businessman he'd once been. Wearing an ill-fitting suit and sitting with his shoulders hunched, the years on the run had clearly worn him down. Yet there were moments, brief as they were, when traces of his old defiance flickered through. He refused to break down or appeal for sympathy, a stoic act that some in the courtroom saw as unrepentant arrogance. For the prosecution, the evidence against Hines was overwhelming. The jury listened to testimony after testimony from investigators, forensic specialists, and even former associates of Hines who had once been implicated in his schemes. Most compelling were the physical pieces of evidence, the recovered notes, the financial trails, and of course the horrifying confession Hines himself had given after his arrest. These all added up to a story so meticulously plotted and darkly calculated that even Hines's defense attorneys struggled to inspire reasonable doubt. The defense, for their part, tried to lean on Hines's character and past success as a self-made businessman. They argued that Hines was a man cornered by financial pressures and rivals who had exerted undue influence over him. They painted Richard Blake as a savvy and ruthless adversary, suggesting that their relationship had been fraught with tension and that the tragedy was a lapse in judgment rather than premeditated murder. But the evidence rendered their arguments hollow. The meticulous nature of the crime, everything from the industrial plastic wrapping to the calculated body disposal at Black Hawk Lake to the years of evasion, pointed clearly to intent and planning, not an impulsive act. The turning point of the trial came when the prosecution replayed clips of Hines's confession in court. The chilling precision with which he had described the events left the jury visibly shaken. His admission of transporting the body across state lines, scouting Black Hawk Lake for its secluded location, and weighting the body down to ensure it wouldn't resurface, painted a picture that was impossible to deny. "I thought it'd stay at the bottom," Hines had said, his words devoid of emotion, like he was discussing a business deal rather than a man's life. That single statement, cold and calculating, seemed to seal his fate in the eyes of the jury. The trial lasted for weeks, but the jury's deliberation was notably brief, lasting less than a day. When the guilty verdict was read, the courtroom was filled with a wave of emotions, relief from Richard Blake's family, quiet satisfaction from the investigators, and a palpable sense of closure for those who had followed the case for years. Hines, however, remained stoic, his expression barely changing as the weight of the verdict settled over him. The sentencing was equally decisive. Given the severity of his crime and the years of evasion that followed, the judge deemed Hines beyond rehabilitation. During sentencing, the judge's statement to Hines echoed the gravity of his actions. "You didn't just take a life. You set into motion a chain of events that have caused unending pain for a family and tainted the peace of an entire community. For that, you will spend the rest of your life in prison." As Hines was escorted out of the courtroom, he glanced back at the spectators, perhaps searching for sympathy, perhaps simply facing the inescapable reality of his fate. If he had hoped for redemption, none was forthcoming. His silence lingered like an unwelcome guest, as if he refused to acknowledge the finality of his sentence. For Richard Blake's family, the verdict brought a bittersweet conclusion to the horrors they had endured. While they finally had answers and a sense of justice, the pain of losing Richard could never truly be erased. His children, now well into adulthood, and his widow, who had carried the weight of the tragedy for decades, expressed bittersweet relief. "We've waited a long time for this day," his widow said outside the courthouse, her voice trembling. "Justice for Richard doesn't bring him back to us, but it does mean the man who caused so much pain won't hurt anyone else ever again." The impact of Hines's conviction extended beyond the courtroom. His case became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the lengths to which greed and ambition can drive a person when left unchecked. It highlighted the resilience of law enforcement and the importance of never giving up, even on a case that had grown cold over the years. For investigators, his conviction was a vindication of nearly 20 years of work, a nod to the fact that sometimes justice moves slowly, but it never gives up. The Black Hawk Lake community also began to heal. For nearly 2 decades, their peaceful retreat had been known not for its beauty, but for the darkness that had transpired there. With Hines behind bars, the lake could start to reclaim its identity, no longer seen as a symbol of tragedy, but as a place of newfound closure. As for Hines, his story didn't end with any dramatic flourish or twist. He was transferred to a maximum security prison to serve his sentence, where he became just another inmate in a sea of forgotten lives. No more aliases, no more deals to broker. As the doors of the prison closed behind him, Hines was left to grapple with the consequences of a life spent chasing greed, ambition, and ultimately destruction. For the world, his story became a lesson in perseverance and justice. But for the Blake family, and for those who worked tirelessly to bring the truth to light, the fateful conclusion to this dark chapter was simply this: justice, though delayed, had finally arrived. The victim's family and lasting pain. For Richard Blake's family, justice came late, nearly 2 decades late, and while the conviction of Matthew Hines offered some level of closure, it could never erase the profound loss they had endured. The courtroom victory that brought the man responsible for Richard's death to justice was small comfort in light of the years of grief, unanswered questions, and emotional turmoil they had suffered. To them, the word justice was bittersweet, a conclusion that could never bring Richard back, but was necessary nonetheless. Richard's family had been thrust into the public eye from the very moment his body had been pulled from Black Hawk Lake. The serene, idyllic backdrop of his murder had made the story a nationwide phenomenon, turning a grieving family's private pain into front-page news. His widow and 2 children, who were only pre-teens when he vanished, had faced unimaginable challenges, not just the loss of a husband and father, but the relentless media scrutiny, the whispers of small-town gossip, and the haunting uncertainty of not knowing when or if answers would ever come. In the early days following Richard's disappearance, the family clung to hope. His absence felt surreal, a nightmare they believed they would wake up from. His widow, Karen Blake, often spoke about how she repeatedly picked up the phone to call her husband, only to remember he wouldn't be there to answer. His children, Sophie and Michael, barely understood the gravity of their father's disappearance, holding on to the tragically simplistic hope that he might walk through the door tomorrow. But tomorrow never came, and as weeks turned into months and months into years, that hope became an unbearable weight, a reminder of what they had lost. Karen eventually accepted the devastating truth when Richard's body was discovered, but acceptance couldn't dull the sharp edges of grief. "Richard wasn't just my husband," she once told a reporter during the trial. "He was the glue that held our family together. When he was ripped away from us, we didn't just lose him, we lost the life we had all built together." Raising 2 children alone in the aftermath of such a tragedy was no easy feat. Karen worked tirelessly to shield Sophie and Michael from the media storm surrounding their father's murder, but the questions always seemed to creep in, at school, during family gatherings, or in the moments of quiet solitude when the absence of Richard became too loud to ignore. She poured all her energy into being a pillar for her children, even as she crumbled in private. Sophie, the elder daughter, struggled through her teenage years with the weight of her father's death. She became fiercely independent, determined to protect her younger brother and her mother from further pain, but inside, she carried an anger she didn't know how to process. "It's hard to grieve someone and hate the world at the same time," Sophie said in her first and only public statement following the trial. "I was mad at the man who took my father's life, mad at the system for taking so long to find him, but mostly, I was mad that I couldn't change any of it." Michael, just 9 years old when his father disappeared, had only vague memories of Richard, flashes of laughter, the smell of his father's cologne, the sound of his voice calling him Buddy from the soccer sidelines. As he grew older, those memories became increasingly distant, replaced by the harsh reality that he would never truly know his father. "I spent most of my life wondering who he was outside of the headlines," Michael admitted. "The world reduced him to a victim, but to me he's just the blurry image of a man I call Dad." For nearly 20 years, the Blakes' grief mixed with frustration. The frustration of an unsolved crime, of a legal system that sometimes seemed too slow, and of unanswered questions that lingered like phantom pains. The manhunt for Matthew Hines was both a source of hope and anxiety for the family. Every new tip, every headline speculating on his whereabouts, reopened old wounds. Karen Blake once admitted she avoided watching the news altogether. "I couldn't stomach the reminders that he was still out there, living his life, while we were stuck trying to piece ours back together." When Hines was finally captured in Arizona, the Blakes could scarcely believe it. Karen recalled the moment the FBI informed her of the arrest. It was almost too much. We'd been holding our breath for so long waiting for justice that I wasn't even sure how to feel when it finally came. The trial that followed would be both vindicating and agonizing for the family. Sitting in the courtroom, listening to the detailed recounting of Heinz's crime and the chilling admission of how he planned and carried out Richard's murder, was like ripping open scars that had only just begun to heal. On the day of the sentencing, Karen and her now adult children sat in solemn unity. They had prepared statements, though none of them felt words could truly express the depth of their loss. Karen spoke first, addressing both the court and Heinz directly. "For 20 years we've lived without him. For 20 years my kids grew up without their father. And for 20 years we've watched a man who should have paid for his crime live a life he didn't deserve. Today, we finally have justice, not just for Richard, but for the life he didn't get to finish." Sophie and Michael followed, their voices steady but trembling with emotion. Sophie refused to acknowledge Heinz, directing her comments instead to her father's memory. "Dad, I hope you know we fought for you every step of the way. We didn't give up on you and we never will." Michael, who had struggled for years to know how to grieve, finally found his voice that day. "You took my dad from me," he told Heinz directly, "and you took something I can never get back, but you can't take who he was to us. You'll spend the rest of your life locked away, but his memory will live free, forever." Even after the sentencing, the pain didn't magically dissipate. Richard Blake's family now carried the weight of navigating life after justice, healing in the aftermath of closure. The absence of Richard remained an unfillable void, but the family found solace in small moments of remembrance. A photograph kept on the mantel, the repeating of a well-worn story about Richard's sense of humor, a toast made in his honor during family gatherings. They clung to the parts of him that no one, not even Matthew Heinz, could take away. For Karen, moving forward meant finding peace in her role as a survivor and mother. For Sophie and Michael, it meant carrying the lessons their father had instilled in them, even in the short time they had him. Together they became a portrait of resilience, proof that while grief may never fully disappear, it doesn't have to define you. The legacy of Richard Blake was not just a memory to his family. It was a call for accountability, justice, and perseverance. Karen Blake, reflecting on the case years later, said it best. "We're not defined by what was taken from us, but by how we choose to carry forward. Richard may be gone, but the love he gave us, and the fight for his justice, will last forever." The meaning of justice. After 20 years. The case of Richard Blake's murder and the eventual conviction of Matthew Heinz became an enduring symbol of the persistence of justice, a testament to how time cannot erase wrongdoing and how hard work and determination can bring even the most elusive criminals to account. For the Blake family, the investigators, and the broader community that had been haunted by the tragedy, justice was not just about holding Heinz accountable. It was about closure, healing, and understanding the deeper meaning of justice itself after 2 agonizing decades. For nearly 20 years, the idea of justice had hung in the air like an intangible promise. It was both a flicker of hope and a heavy burden for the Blake family, who had lived in the shadow of their loss since that horrific discovery at Black Hawk Lake. For Karen Blake, justice meant the culmination of years of unanswered questions and sleepless nights. But it also meant liberation, a profound release from the grip of knowing the man who murdered her husband was out there, living a life her family could no longer share with the person they had lost. When the guilty verdict was read aloud in the courtroom, Karen described the moment as overwhelming. "Justice didn't bring Richard back, but it gave us the one thing we needed: peace." For Richard Blake's children, Sophie and Michael, justice meant the opportunity to reclaim their narrative, no longer defined by the victim's family label that had clung to them for most of their lives. Sophie, now in her late 20s, reflected on what the word justice had come to mean during years of grappling with her father's murder. "Justice isn't just about punishment," she said during a televised interview after the verdict. "It's about reckoning. It's about making sure the truth is seen for what it really is, so that we can finally move forward. We had to live with this mystery for so long, and now, finally, we don't have to carry it alone." In the legal world, the outcome of Heinz's trial became a landmark case, one that showcased how relentless investigation paired with evolving technology could dismantle even the most carefully constructed lies. Investigators and prosecutors alike described the trial as not just a victory for the Blake family but a triumph for crime victims everywhere. The message was clear. No matter how long it takes, no matter how complex the deception, justice remains an unyielding force. Assistant District Attorney Claire Jensen, who led the prosecution team, summed it up well during the press conference after the sentencing. "Justice delayed is not justice denied," she said. "This case reminds us that no matter how much time passes, the truth will find its way forward, and those who harm others can never fully escape accountability." For the investigators who had worked on the case, justice was deeply personal. Many had spent decades combing through evidence, chasing down leads, and reinventing their approach as new advancements in technology unfolded. For them, this wasn't just another case, it was a mission. Detectives like Mike Hansen, who had been part of the original team when Richard Blake's body was first discovered, described the years spent catching Matthew Hines as both exhausting and deeply rewarding. "I remember staring at that lake the morning they found him," Hansen admitted during an interview. "I knew it wasn't going to be an easy case, but I also knew we couldn't just walk away. We owed it to Richard, to his family, and to that town to make sure we saw it through." For the broader Black Hawk Lake community, the trial and conviction brought an end to years of whispers and unease. The idyllic lakeside town had long been stained by the memory of the crime, its peaceful image shattered, replaced with the ominous weight of being known as the site of a gruesome murder. Summer tourists, once drawn to the area for its serene waters and dense woodlands, had steadily dwindled in number, leaving the town to grapple with an identity overshadowed by tragedy. Yet with Hines now behind bars, a sense of renewal began to take hold. Local residents expressed relief, not just for the Blake family but for their town's ability to move past its dark chapter. "This place deserves to be known for its beauty again, not for what happened here," a local business owner said in the wake of the trial. But justice, as those involved in the case came to understand, was not just about punishment, it was about accountability and growth. For Karen Blake, justice meant telling her husband's story so that no one would forget not just the crime but the man he was before it. She remained outspoken about the importance of pursuing justice for victims, often speaking at events hosted by advocacy groups for families impacted by violent crime. Karen's journey became an emblem of strength, her voice a reminder that those left behind also carry the weight of seeking justice. "Justice is not an event," Karen told an audience at one such event. "It's a process. It's a fight you carry with you every single day. And sometimes justice isn't about what happens in a courtroom. It's about how you choose to live your life after the unthinkable happens." The pursuit of justice in the Blake case also underscored the transformative power of technology in modern law enforcement. Investigators credited advancements such as DNA analysis, artificial intelligence, and digital forensics for turning around what had initially seemed like a hopelessly cold case. These tools didn't just solve a crime, they redefined the limits of what was possible in pursuing long-dormant cases. For tech developers and advocacy groups, the conviction was proof that technology could be wielded as a force for good, bridging gaps in the justice system and bringing long-overdue answers to families like the Blakes. Yet even with all its technology and triumph, justice had its limitations. For Richard Blake's family, it could never bring back the years they lost, the birthdays he'd missed, or the memories they might have made together. The truth and the verdict carried immense weight, but they also came with the inescapable reality that their lives had been irreversibly changed on that tragic October day. In the words of Michael Blake, "They caught him, and they proved what he did. But it doesn't take away the ache. It doesn't fill the space where my dad is supposed to be." In the end, the meaning of justice after 20 years was different for everyone involved. For Karen, Sophie, and Michael, it was about honoring Richard's memory. For the investigators, it was about completing a mission that had tested their resilience in every possible way. For the town of Black Hawk Lake, it was about healing and reclaiming its identity. And for Hines, justice meant the inescapable reality that no lie could outrun the truth forever. The case of Richard Blake was not forgotten. Its lessons were woven into conversations about justice, perseverance, and technology's place in finding truths that might otherwise remain buried. And though the road to justice had been long and painful, it had proven one undeniable fact: justice, though delayed, remained